because this is something that might confuse you on the test for next week when I'm asking you questions about this. And I just want to make sure it's very clear what we're doing and how you know which question is which, okay? So on the test, I'm probably going to give you a big word problem that asks you to find a confidence interval. You're going to do all of this, but you're going to have to figure out if you're using the big chart or the small chart, right? There's a whole different process with the small chart that we do than when we do the big chart, okay? Now, does anyone remember the difference between when we use the big chart versus the small chart? Good. The small chart is when we use the population standard deviation. The big chart is when the question gives us the sample standard deviation. It's a very small difference between the questions that I can ask. But basically, small chart, population, big chart, sample. Okay. Now, sometimes I won't exactly tell you what which standard deviation it is. You kind of have to infer it from what the question's saying, which is why I'm going to do this activity with you. So we all kind of know what chart to use, okay? I'm going to do number 1 with you, and then I'm going to have you figure out the other ones on your own. Let's do this. We're given a big question. It's going to be very intimidating when you see it because it's like got a lot of words in it. And usually what I like to do is just write down what all the symbols I'm given and what numbers they interact with it or correspond to, okay? So during a study of body temperatures, we took a bunch of temperatures. Suppose that we only have the first 10 temperatures to work with. What symbol does 10 represent here? 10, right? N is the sample size. That's what we're given, okay? It says that the mean and standard deviation of these 10 scores were 98.44 and 0.30 respectively, okay? What does 98.44 represent? The mean, but what type of mean? Ooh, is it the population mean? Ooh, why do you say sample? Yeah, it's very subtle here, and on the test I might be a little bit more explicit with you, but here it says the 10 scores, which is our sample, and it's talking about the mean of those 10 scores in our sample. So this is actually talking about the sample mean. Now, actually, for all these questions, you're going to be given the sample mean, so don't worry too much about that, okay? What do you think 0.30 represents? And which standard deviation? S, right? Why is it S and not the population one? Yeah, like it's literally like almost in the same sentence, like phrasing as when it's talking about the 10 temperatures. So because it's like kind of grouped together with N, we know that this represents S. Okay, so we have all this stuff. We want to find a 95% confidence interval. We're not actually going to do it, but what chart are we going to use? The big chart or the small chart? The big chart, right? Because we're given S, we're using the big chart, okay? Now, I'm not actually going to ask you to find these confidence intervals. What I want you to do is maybe in the same groups that you used to put up these Post-it notes, I want you to discuss for the rest of these questions, are we using the big chart or are we using the small chart? Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to think about that and we'll come back in a little bit. Here, I know some of these were a little bit tricky, so don't freak out if you got them wrong at first. Let's take a look at number 2. This one, I think now I'm looking back at it, it could go either way, honestly, but who wrote up this one? Yes. Do you kind of want to take us through your thought process?
Yeah, so I underlined, I didn't do it on there, but I underlined like all the important things in the problem. So I underlined 36 St. Bernard dogs, and that was my sample size. And then it says the sample mean is 193, so that's X bar. And then I read that the standard deviation of all St. Bernards is 18 pounds. And that's, I assumed it was like the whole species, not all of the sample. So I decided it was population standard deviation instead of sample size, or sample standard deviation. And then 99% confidence interval, and so you use the small chart.
Perfect. This one was a little bit tricky. I kind of understand why some of you would be like, oh, that might be the sample standard deviation, because it was introduced like right after the sample was introduced. So I wouldn't feel too bad if you thought that one was the big chart. I probably wouldn't throw something like that at you, but nice job, Alyssa, on that one. Any questions on number 2? All right, going on to example 3. This one was like the exams on statistics. Who wrote up this one? Oh, do you want to take us through your thought process here?
So first, I looked and it said it had a standard deviation. After it talked about the population mean, so I assumed that it was the population standard deviation.
Mm-hmm.
And then it said random sample 36, so N is 36. And then it says the sample mean is 60.
Mm-hmm.
And then a 50% confidence interval. So because it gave us sigma, it's a small chart.
Perfect. This one is a little bit more obvious to me because, well, it talks about the sample, but it introduced the standard deviation before it even talked about what the sample was, right? So there was no way 3 points could be the sample standard deviation because we didn't even introduce what the sample was when we talked about the standard deviation, right? The sample came after we talked about that. So whenever you see that, that's a big hint that what we're talking about is definitely the population standard deviation, not the sample standard deviation, because we don't even know what the sample is, right? All right. Any questions on number 3? All right, going to number 4. This one was the National Center for Education Statistics. Who wrote up this one? Ashley, do you want to take us through this one?
Yeah. So I saw that they surveyed 1,000
Mhm. Yes. Mhm.
Based on that, I saw that this one.
Perfect, right? This one might have been a little bit tricky, but when you see the term surveyed, that means that you're taking a sample, okay? So when I survey something, that's a big hint that, okay, that's what the sample is. So you know that they're introducing what the sample is. If they're talking about the sample and then they're like, the mean is this and the standard deviation is that, they're talking about the mean of the sample and the standard deviation of the sample, okay? So that's kind of a big hint that we're given the sample standard deviation and not the population standard deviation, okay? Any questions on number 4? All right, next, I want to know the average amount of steps people took per day. Who wrote this one? Shannon, do you want to take us through this one?
Yeah, so it says she took a sample of 14 people, so I know that has to be 14. And then in the next sentence, it says the sample mean was 3,520, so I knew that was going to be X bar.
Mm-hmm.
And then because it said sample, I just knew it was going to be the sample standard deviation.
Mm-hmm.
And then because it gave us S, I knew it was big chart.
Perfect, right? Big hint is if I introduce the standard deviation in like the same sentence as I'm talking about like the sample mean and everything else, that's a big hint that I'm given the sample standard deviation, okay? Now, I'm gonna say that these are a little bit harder than something I give to you on the exam. I think on the exam, I might not give you the symbols. I might not be like X bar equals this, but I'll try to make it pretty obvious that I'm talking about the population standard deviation, sample standard deviation. I'll put that in the question. But it is an important skill to be able to look at a question and kind of deduce what we're actually given in the question without being explicitly told it, okay? Any question about deciding which chart to use? Alrighty, then I guess we're about ready for our quiz, right? You want me to leave that up on the board? Yeah.